Hello everyone. Before we begin the story, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment letting us know your location and the time you're tuning in. This ensures YouTube continues to deliver stories just like this one to your feed. Picture a walk through the Appalachian Hills after dark. The trees here are so dense they appear to be exchanging secrets. The air is heavy and damp, and the faint moonlight barely defines shapes you can't be sure are really there. Within these deep, secluded hills lies a family history so deeply unsettling that local residents refuse to discuss it. When asked, their voices drop, they nervously glance around, and swiftly change the topic. This is because the story goes beyond simple misfortune or poverty. This is the account of a bloodline that was intentionally twisted and collapsed in on itself, generation after generation. The practice saw 7 full lines of siblings marrying each other, resulting in children whose very existence was both a defiance of natural law and a horrific curse passed down like a family heirloom. Think about that, 7 generations. Not a one-time error, but a recurring, ritualistic pattern, as if the family were bound by an unbreakable, written-in-blood covenant. They allowed no outsiders in, and those born into the family were permitted no escape. This cycle persisted for over a century, entirely hidden in the dark mountain folds, far removed from the reach of the church, the law, or the modern world. This is not mere folklore or a campfire legend. Physical records exist. We have documented births and deaths, far too many of them, recorded in Bibles with worn leather bindings and in county ledgers that officials feared reading aloud. Though rare, photographs have survived. They show faces that appear both strangely familiar and disturbingly foreign. Their eyes hold an unsettling quality, perhaps from seeing too much of the same blood reflected back at them. The most bizarre detail? This family was convinced their actions were righteous. They genuinely believed it was the only means to preserve the purity of their bloodline, to keep their legacy, name, and land untouched by foreign influence. But this quest for purity demanded a horrifying price. That price was paid by the children, in screams during labor, in unmarked graves, and in the progressive haunting that afflicted each subsequent generation. Tonight, we will pull back this veil of secrecy. We're entering a world you were never meant to know existed. To grasp the origins of this tragedy, we must journey back to the late 1700s, when the first settlers ventured into the Appalachian valleys. These were not people of influence or wealth. They were outcasts, families escaping scandals or debts from the East, essentially drifters. Among them was one specific family whose name I will intentionally omit. This is not because they are forgotten, but because their descendants live silently today, and the shame of that name clings to every document like residual smoke. They arrived with almost nothing, perhaps a rusted rifle and a fierce determination for solitude. The mountains provided the perfect sanctuary. The isolated hollows and ridges acted as natural barriers. Visitors seldom knocked, and those who did rarely left. It was here that the seeds of the inward-folding bloodline were first sown. Initially, they intermarried with other nearby, struggling families, but slowly, their perspective twisted due to a combination of pride and suspicion. They grew certain that outsiders posed a threat, seeking to corrupt them or claim their possessions and children. As the Civil War came and went, railroads inched closer, and new settlements appeared, this family tightened its perimeter. They abandoned the church and stopped marrying outsiders. They turned inward, and in that deep isolation, a dangerous new rule was established: keep the bloodline strictly inside the bloodline. The first known union between a brother and sister sparked hushed gossip among the neighbors. Some called it a sin, others argued it was necessary for survival. Regardless, it set a grim standard. Soon, cousins, and then uncles and nieces, followed suit. By the early 1800s, the marriage of a brother to his sister was not the exception, it was the expectation. Children were born, but many perished quickly. The survivors often carried the physical evidence of the inbreeding. Some were mute, others had skeletal deformities, and many struggled to speak or comprehend. Yet, the cycle persisted. To this family, Exiting the bloodline was viewed as a fate worse than death itself. Thus, the pattern was fixed, a closed, 7-generation chain, each link forged by the same taboo act. By the time the 20th century arrived, this family had become a spectral presence within the county, half recognized, half denied, and universally feared. But records, including birth certificates, marriage licenses, and even coroner reports, speak the undeniable truth. For over a century and a half, this family effectively sealed itself off. To truly understand the toll of 7 generations of sibling marriage, you must observe the children, for they bore the weight of decisions made long before their birth. Locals share tales of children who would not speak, not from shyness, but from an inability to. Some grew to adulthood without uttering a single word, communicating instead with animalistic cries, gestures, or unnerving grunts that echoed through the hollows. Others possessed faces that were strangely familiar but unsettlingly wrong, jaws too narrow, cheekbones too sharp, eyes spaced just a little too widely apart. The same features were relentlessly copied and replicated across generations, until the family began to look like a single, disturbing face endlessly reproduced. The tragedies extended beyond their appearance. Many infants did not survive their first few months. Midwives, when the family permitted their presence, spoke of stillbirths, twisted bodies, and cries that faded too quickly. Mothers buried their babies in quiet, unmarked graves near the tree line and returned to their homes with earth still staining their hands. Through it all, the family acted as if this immense suffering was merely their destined burden. Dark rumors also circulated about the survivors, their minds often described as fragile, flickering like small flames in a draft. Some never achieved literacy or learned to count. Others exhibited unpredictable, frightening violence, even toward their own kin. Visitors who stumbled upon the remote homestead reported profound silences, abruptly shattered by sudden, unsettling laughter, or worse, inexplicable screams. The children were strictly raised to obey, not to question, to obey the rules of the bloodline, and especially the unspoken law, never marry an outsider. The older relatives drilled this into them like holy scripture: this is our tradition, this is how it must continue. But the unavoidable reality, visible to outsiders and desperate to be hidden by the family, was clear: each generation grew progressively weaker. Their bones were more brittle, their minds more clouded, their lives shorter. And yet, in a twisted paradox, the curse was self-perpetuating, because even these damaged children matured into adults, and when they did, the cycle was immediately renewed. The family was fundamentally trapped, forced to endure the scars of the past, unable to escape the inescapable shadow of the blood that bound them. The most bizarre element of this story is perhaps not the family itself, but the surrounding community. Because, make no mistake, the neighbors were fully aware. They saw the children. They heard the desperate night cries, and they whispered amongst themselves. However, few dared to speak up publicly. While isolation was common in the small Appalachian communities and privacy was highly valued, this went beyond simple discretion. This silence was rooted in a potent mix of fear, pity, and something far darker: complicity. Some believed the family was divinely cursed for their sins. Others muttered that the land was bad luck and interfering would invite the same curse into their own homes. So, people averted their gaze. They shook their heads, crossed the road, and chose to pretend they hadn't seen. There are accounts of dedicated schoolteachers who attempted to intervene. They'd see a child arrive, unwashed and barefoot, staring blankly from a desk, incapable of even spelling their own name. The teachers submitted reports, yet nothing changed. When county officials did attempt to investigate, they were met with fierce hostility. The family refused entry, and the neighbors told the authorities to simply let it go, that it was safer to leave the family in peace. The mountain thus preserved its secrets. Even the church, the one body that should have openly condemned these incestuous unions, remained silent. Ministers preached vaguely about sin but never dared to name the family. Some theories suggest fear of violent retribution. Others hint that family donations kept the sermons deliberately vague. Whatever the motivation, the pulpit remained silent, allowing the cycle to continue unchecked. Darker rumors also persisted. Stories shared in hushed tones in local bars suggested that some townsfolk, either desperate or intoxicated, would seek out the family's daughters, trading currency or provisions for silent encounters. If these whispers hold any truth, the community's silence wasn't just fear, it was self-preservation. The family remained hidden in plain sight. Everyone knew, but no one intervened. The town effectively became an accessory to the tragedy, standing by as one generation after another was sacrificed to the same cycle. Through their silence, they allowed the bloodline to slowly and quietly collapse in on itself, like an old house with rotting beams, until nothing solid remained. By the fifth generation, the secrecy had transformed into ritualistic doctrine. It was no longer a simple matter of survival or stubbornness, it had become a twisted, self-proclaimed holy law passed down from parent to child. Inside their secluded cabins, nighttime stories centered on purity, the extreme dangers posed by outsiders, and the absolute importance of the family name over life itself. Children grew up believing that to marry outside the bloodline was to betray their ancestors and dishonor everything the family had established. The cycle was thus sanctified, not just practiced. A young boy wouldn't seek a stranger to court, he would wait for his sister to reach a suitable age. A girl was taught not to dream of leaving, her sole duty was to carry the bloodline forward, regardless of the personal suffering involved. Neighbors claimed to hear strange, low chanting during gatherings in the woods, hymns distorted into something unrecognizable. Whether these were genuine rituals or just the sound of drunken voices echoing through the hollers is unknown, but the legend endured. People believed the family was bound by something stronger than marriage certificates and secrets, a generational vow, renewed with each birth, tying them together like iron chains. When children were born, no matter how frail or disfigured, they were presented not as a tragedy, but as sacred proof that the bloodline had endured. Survival itself became hallowed, even if it guaranteed that the next generation would suffer even more profoundly. This ritualized cycle didn't just create silence, it created a fierce, unwavering pride in their isolation, pride in repelling outsiders, and pride in viewing their suffering as a symbol of strength. This dangerous form of pride was the final lock that prevented the family from ever achieving freedom. If you have watched this far, you possess more courage than most. Tell us in the comments, if you were part of this bloodline, would you have obeyed the immense weight of family history, or would you have been the one to break the cycle? Because history teaches us one clear lesson: when a detrimental pattern is repeated enough times, it ceases to look like a mistake and begins to look like destiny. And for this family, destiny was nothing more than a chain passed from sibling to sibling, mother to son, for 7 uninterrupted generations. Every chain, no matter how tightly forged, eventually yields. For this family, the breaking point was not a single rebellious act, but sheer exhaustion. By the 7th generation, the effects of inbreeding could no longer be ignored or concealed. The children were sicker and weaker than any preceding generation. Many lacked the strength to survive more than a few days after birth. Others who lived were mentally vacant, lost and wandering, unable to function independently. County doctors started to note the issue. Early 1900s records described their condition as degenerative, though doctors seldom dared to explicitly name the cause. Still, the underlying truth was inescapable: the bloodline had consumed itself. By that time, the family cabins stood largely vacant. The land, once fiercely protected, had fallen into complete decay. Fields were barren, roofs had collapsed, and stray animals wandered where children once played. The surviving adults were frail and gaunt, highly suspicious of every stranger, but too weak to enforce the old rules with the same severity. It was as if the line itself was pleading for its own demise, begging for release. A few descendants managed to flee the mountains, settling in nearby towns, but they unknowingly carried the curse with them. Records document fleeting, short-lived marriages, children abandoned to orphanages, and deaths that came far too soon. It was as if the blood refused to release them, constantly pulling them back toward the same inevitable tragedy, no matter how far they ran. By mid-century, the line was fractured and scattered. Vestiges of the family survived in silence, attempting to blend into the general population, their origins only whispered about but never documented. Others vanished entirely, their names erased, their graves unmarked. The few remaining locals regarded the story as a cautionary tale. Parents warned their children not to venture too deeply into the hollows, nor to approach the pale figures sometimes seen near the trees. Hunters swore they saw them, silent watchers with eyes too bright in the darkness. Whether these were actual sightings or just the echoes of collective guilt is uncertain. What we know for sure is that the bloodline could not endure. It folded in on itself until only ruin was left. 7 generations of suffering and secrecy, culminating not in a dramatic end, but a slow, unavoidable collapse. Yet, even after death, secrets often survive. The tale of 7 generations of sibling marriages is more than just the story of one family. It illustrates how history buries its most terrifying truths, leaving only fragments for us to piece together. Even now, traces of this bloodline linger. They are found in brittle county records, in sepia-toned photographs, and in abandoned cabins being slowly consumed by vines. If you know where to look, you can even see them in the faces of certain descendants who still live among us, faces that carry the same haunted expression, the same bone structure, and the echo of the same eyes passed down from those distant mountains. But what remains most haunting isn't the bloodline itself, but the pervasive silence that enveloped it, a silence so dense that even today, locals are hesitant to speak. They shake their heads, insist some things are better left buried, and move on. Because this narrative isn't only about genetics, it's about complicity. It's about how an entire community collectively chose to look away, chose not to act, and chose not to intervene, until the line finally extinguished itself. For those who study the consequences, the lesson is stark: isolation fosters secrecy, and secrecy inevitably leads to tragedy. When pride dictates ritual, and when blood is deemed more important than love, the result is not strength, but destruction. This family was ultimately destroyed by its own desperate obsession to remain untouched. However, there is another reason why this story still disturbs us. It's not just history, it functions as a mirror, a potent reminder of what human beings are capable of when they become convinced of their own untouchability, when they feel chosen and different. This family's demise serves as one example of what happens when the natural instinct to protect descends into an obsession for control, and when tradition transforms into an inescapable cage. Some sources claim the line has completely vanished. Others whisper that it still continues in the shadows of remote hollows, where the trees guard their secrets still. No definitive conclusion exists. But this we know: 7 generations left behind a permanent stain, a story too dark for history books, too unsettling for polite conversation. This was a story you were never intended to hear. And now that you have heard it, the burden of that knowledge is yours to carry. Thank you for watching. If this story has left you haunted, please remember to like and subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you are from and how you first discovered this video. Until next time, remember that the past is never truly buried.